Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the briefing room. Yes, indeed, it is Tuesday at 4 o'clock Eastern. That's time for our favorite show, the show that was really designed to let you as an audience member peek over the shoulder of an analyst who pokes around under the hood of a cool technology in the enterprise software space. My name, of course, is Eric Cavanaugh. I will be your moderator for today's event. And folks, we're very excited to have this company here in the briefing room today. The topic is a very interesting and compelling one, self-service access and exploration of big data. So that right there is a slide about yours truly and enough about me. As many of you know by now, the whole mission of the briefing room is to reveal the essential characteristics of enterprise software. So what we do is we pair analysts with vendors, and they do not coordinate for the show. The idea being we want to preserve the kind of organic conversation that occurs between an interesting vendor doing something in a particular space and an analyst, typically an independent analyst or one from a small firm, who knows a particular domain or discipline. So we're literally showing you a live analyst briefing. We really want you to get involved as well. So we always get a lot of really good questions from our audience. Don't be shy. You can send them in at any time using the Q&A component of your webcast console. So let's kind of move along here. So we do different topics every month. December is sort of a catch-all month. It's innovation is the idea. So we can do just about anything that's very interesting and innovative. And the topic for today really is quite fascinating stuff. We're talking about access to big data. So it's interesting. We're talking about taking a different approach to managing the process of giving access to end users. So I'm sure you've all heard of self-service business intelligence or self-service analytics, and quite frankly, a lot of times that's a pretty glowing term to use. I guess you could call it a euphemism for what really amounts to a fair amount of hand-holding leading to you being able to get your data. But a fair amount of hand-holding, of course, is better than gatekeepers preventing you from getting the stuff that you want. And let's face it, there have been a whole range of innovations over the last few years in terms of giving people access to data. If you go all the way back, talk about stuff like ODBC and JDBC, just being able to access data from databases. But then we have all these other techniques. Of course, ETL is a great way of moving data around. We've been talking about that for years, extract, transform, load. But again, that's kind of under the covers, and it's more for moving large sets of data from one place into a data warehouse typically, or even replicating it to some kind of a target system, whether it's customer-facing or otherwise. There are lots of ways behind the scenes that IT people can push buttons and can make connections for you to get you the data that you want. But obviously that is something that takes time and effort to pull off. So just to give you some background here, we dug up, actually our producer Rebecca Joswick dug up this really cool graphic in the background. It is a design that Charles Babbage conceived called the analytical engine way back in 1834. So we've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, but it's really only in the last few years that things have really picked up across the board to enable the kind of dynamic access that, let's face it, users want. And we should also consider the fact that the Internet, in provisioning all kinds of data, really has changed expectations for people. And now people who can get very good at accessing different kinds of data online, either at home or at work, for research or other purposes, now we're kind of spoiled. We don't want to wait weeks or days even to get access to a certain data set. We want to be able to sign in, say who we are, prove who we are, and get the stuff we want. So that's what we're talking about today, and it's going to be a very interesting show, I'm quite sure. The cloud and big data, of course, are sort of combining to force out a lot of these innovations. And for those of you who are here for the pre-show, we were chit-chatting about some of the new social media spats that are causing some access issues. Let's face it, Instagram and Twitter are now in a spat, or Instagram disabled their integration with Twitter such that their photos don't show up very easily. They can do a workaround. I was reading about it, but obviously that's not good for the end user, but it is interesting. It's an interesting metaphor to the topic of today. So let's go ahead and move on. Analyst Robin Bloor, our very own Robin, is the analyst today. He just came back from a tour of Silicon Valley, so he's all excited about that. So Cirro is the company in the briefing room today. They provide a single method to access any type of data on any platform in any environment. It's a technology that has been touted, at least in some cases, as an alternative to data virtualization, which of course was an alternative to the more traditional route of using stuff like ETL and physically provisioning connections to data for end consumers. So with that, Mark Theissen, he is the CEO at Cirro. We're very happy to have him online today, calling in from Southern California, I believe, and he was at Data Allegro. Of course, that's now a Microsoft product, a massively parallel warehouse, I believe is what they call it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand the keys over to Mark. And Mark, the floor is now yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eric, and happy to be here today. You know, with Cirro, we're all about bringing that big data to the desktop, and it seems, you know, in the press and everything we're reading nowadays, we hear about how big data is, and the 3 V's and the 4 V's and all the other types of V's that there are. And you know, when you get down to it, really the challenge with big data is really not about capturing that data or storing the data, as much as it is more so about the ability to access the data. So being able to take big data and mash it up with other sources of data that you have in the enterprise, and doing this with the tools that you already have on the desktop. So indeed, I'm trying to move.
Just click on the slide there and use the down arrow on your keyboard.
Okay.
There you go.
So indeed, yeah, there we go. Indeed, you know, companies today are facing a big data dilemma, and in this dilemma, I think they're looking at 2 things. One thing is they're looking at all the different types of data that they have and that they want to play with and bring together. And it's not just the new sources of data like machine data, sensor data, global positioning data, or social media data. It's about the traditional data sources as well, whether that's really, you know, data warehouses, data marts, ODSs, and other data sources that they already have within the enterprise. And they also have a lot of different tools. They have things like Excel and BI tools and data visualization tools and things like that. And they want to be able to use these tools to be able to access all the types of data that they have. So the challenge there is that there's all types of platforms and places that this data exists. Everything from traditional mainframes to relational databases to data warehouses and data marts. We have things in the cloud. We have things out of the cloud. We have new technologies, things like NoSQL. We have Hadoop, the most popular processing framework for big data. And you know, this landscape of all these different places where data is stored is going to continue to expand. In fact, the world of data going forward is going to be a distributed world with many different best-of-breed technologies and platforms out there, and each of those being their own analytical data source in their own right, and people are going to want to be able to go across those different sources to be able to do analysis. And by the way, old technology doesn't go away. So, you know, I mentioned mainframe earlier, and it was funny. I was reading something in the press the other day. I had no idea. You know, we've always heard about mainframes going away, but IBM in 2011 did $27 billion in revenue on mainframe sales. So that just kind of goes to the point and proves the point, I guess, that old technologies don't go away. Rather, we keep adding new technologies on top of those old technologies. So how are people going about accessing all this big data? And what we see in the marketplace is 2 different approaches. The first approach, which is really what I would call the incumbent approach, is where you have them telling you, go ahead and take all this big data and go ahead and put that into Hadoop, process that data in Hadoop, and then move all of that data into an existing large database that you have, maybe something like Exadata, okay? And, you know, there's some problems with that in the sense that this is a very expensive proposition for people to implement, right? Not only are they, investing in their Hadoop infrastructure, but they're going to also have to significantly expand the size of their existing database environment. And by the way, you're not going to have drill through to the detailed data that's sitting in Hadoop. You're only going to have aggregate data. And that aggregate data might still be too large to put in your database or to transfer in a reasonable amount of time. So another approach that we see is more of a Hadoop-centric approach, if you will. The idea being that not only do you have all your big data in Hadoop, but you also move the data from your data warehouse, your data marts, your operational data stores, and other sources into Hadoop as well. Now, again, this is an expensive proposition, and it's not a reasonable thing to expect people to move or migrate complete data warehouse or data marts environments into Hadoop. There's a lot of infrastructure behind these environments, a lot of ETL that's been done, and moving all of that to point to Hadoop would be a tremendous project and a tremendous amount of work. And besides, there's good reasons to keep your data in databases in terms of having things like ACID compliance for transaction safety and things like that. The other problem with this approach is that it requires new tools. You need to have new BI tools that work on top of Hadoop. And it also requires a new set of skills. So both of these approaches are really about bringing the data to the processing. And with Cirro, we believe the real way you achieve scale as this environment expands that we're in is to take the processing to the data. So what the market really needs is an enterprise data hub, that ability to access any type of data, whether that's structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, on any platform, whether that's in a database in Hadoop or another NoSQL data source, and in any environment, whether that's in the cloud, a private cloud, or in the data center itself. So with Cirro, we allow people to keep the data where it's stored, and we allow them to use their existing tools that they have on the desktops already, things like their BI tools, Excel, and other products that they already are familiar with and know how to use. They can go through the Cirro Data Hub, which is a single point of entry that allows you to access all of this data. So the Data Hub really provides three main services. It does language translation services, the idea that you feed SQL in and it'll create queries in whatever language is necessary, whether that's SQL or Hive or MapReduce or any other language that's required. It also does federation of query processing, so the idea that we distribute the processing of the query as close to the data as possible, in other words, taking the processing to the data. And the Data Hub also provides data movement services. So transparently to the user, when data is required to be moved, the Data Hub is handling that. So this is what really allows this performance at scale across multiple data sources. And it enables us easy access to any type of data on any platform and any environment, whether that's the cloud, in the data center, or in a private cloud. So what we're really doing is simplifying this access, and a good example is when people want to do mashups, right? So I want to do a mashup, I want to play with some Twitter data, and I want to play with some other data that I have in a data mart in a data warehouse. And I want to be able to do some mashups with it. So I have structured and unstructured data. So typically, if you think about the conventional approach of how people have to access that data, people other than themselves are managing the access to the data. Why? Because you need all these skills and resources that go around this to be able to do something like a simple mashup. That requires people's time, and it does take time to get the data for you to just be able to play with it. So with Cirro, we have our Data Hub, and you can use any access tool. You can use a BI tool, a visualization tool. You can use a command line interface if it's an application, or you could use our Cirro Analyst, which is an Excel plugin, to create your queries. You submit that query to the Data Hub, and then the Data Hub will orchestrate the overall execution of that query across the various participating systems within your data ecosystem. So that's how we simplify the access of data. So from an architecture perspective, Data Hub being our centerpiece in our architecture, what it has in it is a cost-based federation optimizer. So what that allows us to do is take a query in, figure out all the different possible ways that you could run it, and then determine what would be the most efficient way to run it and go ahead and execute that. So within the Data Hub, we also have things like smart caching, the idea that we have a distributed cache that we manage across all the participating systems within a data ecosystem. We also can dynamically optimize our plans, so as queries are in flight and executing, we can actually adjust our query execution plans to be most optimal based on certain parts of a query being completed. We also have the ability to normalize all the different options we have for execution, so that when we're going to choose the one we want to run, we're doing an apples-to-apples comparison and choosing the best approach for running a query. When it comes to metadata, when it comes to traditional sources, we look up the metadata at the time we execute a query. And then when it comes to unstructured data sources, we keep our own metadata repository within the data hub. So that keeps our performance history, it keeps things about the size of the data, when it was refreshed, all those types of things you would expect to see in the metadata. Also within the data hub, we have a function library, which is a library of functions, and there's over 100 functions in there that you can use as building blocks to build complex analyses. And you can use these building blocks to do complex analyses, and you would do that within the Cirro Analyst Excel plugin product. And that's a place where you can do data exploration in a self-service way. You can also do analysis, and then you can also do publishing. So Cirro Analyst is indeed an analyst workbench, if you will, that allows people to really play with the data themselves without having to pre-stage the data, without having to pre-process the data, and with little to no help from their IT organization. They can help themselves. As long as you know how to use a function within Excel, you'll be able to use Cirro Analyst. And I'll give you guys a little demo of that shortly. And then we also have finally a last component here, which is called the Cirro Multi-Store. It's an optional component in our architecture, but it is a pre-built data store that can store both structured and unstructured data. You can use it for multiple purposes. So if you have data on a mainframe that you need to drop and put someplace, you may want to put it in the multi-store. If you have a need for additional workspace that you want to add to the data ecosystem, you can use the multi-store for that. If you want to create a data mart for letting other people query data that people are creating, you could use the multi-store for that. So the multi-store, it tends to be just a convenient thing that most people want to use. Alternatively, you might want to use Greenplum or any other products that are out there as well. So in a typical deployment, we have our data hub accessing multiple different sources. And one thing to point out here is when it comes to Hadoop, many of the products out there today are limited to things like Hive. They can only do HQL or the Hive query language. With Cirro, not only do we support Hive and HQL, but we also support MapReduce, so that if we have a need to, the Cirro Data Hub can actually generate MapReduce directly against HDFS, which is pretty cool. The other thing that about the function library is that it is extensible and customizable for a customer's needs. So typically, we'll get some functions that will come from an IT organization. And those functions typically are things like parsers. So if you wanted to do some clickstream analysis across some application logs that you have sitting in Hadoop, the one thing you need to give us is a parser. That parser would be published as a function to the data hub, and that parser then becomes available to those people using the Cirro Analyst plugin, where they're doing the data exploration and analysis and things like that. Now, what's particularly cool is once you do something, say I did this mashup, I have some Twitter data and I've done some filtering of it, and I've done some cleansing of it, and I've joined it to Oracle or some other databases, and I've enriched that data, and I want to make it now available for other people to use. Well, in that case, you publish it, and what you're doing is you're publishing it back to the data hub as a view. So that view is now available to all your data consumers using their BI tools and data visualization tools. They connect to the data hub. They see your view. To them, it looks just like any other database view. But under the hood, you might be doing a join between something like Hadoop and Oracle or some other databases. So that's what a deployment looks like. And in terms of where we deploy, we deploy in the cloud, in any type of cloud environment, whether that's a private cloud or up in Amazon, as well as we can deploy on bare metal hardware as well. So what I thought I'd do is take the time and give you a quick demo. In this case, I'm going to want to, it's going to be something simple because we're not going to have a whole lot of time for this, but I want to summarize the number of tweets per hour for only certain keywords, and I'm going to do it from the raw Twitter feed, so it's a JSON file, and it's just sample Twitter data, and the keywords that I'm interested in I have stored in a table in a MySQL database. So I'm going to have to do a join between Hadoop and MySQL, and then I'm going to bring the results back into Excel. So typically, if you go back to that conventional approach I was talking about, this would be all the steps that you would have to go through with the different colors representing different sets of skills. So with Cirro, we'll accomplish this within 7 cells of an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my desktop and share my desktop, at which point, oh, there we go. You guys should be able to see that. Eric, can you confirm you got Excel on your screen?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, beautiful. So what I have here is Excel open. Our plugin, the Cirro Analyst plugin, lives here in the Data tab of Excel. One of the things I might want to do is go ahead and click the Data Explorer. And I know I have some Twitter data, so I can navigate here and find some Twitter data. And in that case, I have it under User. Let's see here, User. Oh, there it is, under Twitter. And then here in CA Test. So I can say go to Cirro Function. And now I've brought up our function wizard. And here I'm now able to say, okay, we have all kinds of functions, the types of things you would expect to see for an analyst type tool. In this case, what I want to do is a source parser. And I click OK. And I'm going to use a Twitter parse. And in that case, then, I'm going to go ahead and pick some columns. So now that it's parsed, I can pick things like the raw 140-character tweet and when it was created, which are the only two things I need for this particular use case. If I want to get a sample of this data, I can click on the function wizard and go over to Output, and I'm going to put some output onto the sheet, and I'm going to use the Twitter parse as the input, so I'm just using Excel references like you would normally do. And then I can put some of the sample data. I'll put some sample data right here. Click OK, and then click Refresh, and I get a sample of that data. So here's the raw Twitter data. I apologize if there's anything nasty in there, but you know it is raw Twitter data. And then also, this is when it's created. So I see I have hours and minutes, and I want to count tweets by the hour, so I'll need to clean that up a little bit. So I'll do a couple things here. Go back to my function wizard. And I'm going to do a text function just to make it easy to work with the data. And I'm going to go ahead and lowercase it. So we have a to lower function here. And I'm going to use the Twitter parse as the input. And I'm going to apply that to the tweet text. I also saw that I wanted to do something with the date. I wanted to round the hour on that. So I'll find a date function for that. As you can imagine with analytics, we have all kinds of date functions. In this case, I just want to go ahead and round the hour. I'll use the previous cell as the input, and I'm going to apply that to the created at. The other thing that I may want to do, since I want to count words, is I have another text function that separates words, because words get smushed together in things like Twitter. So I have a word separate, and I'll just use the previous cell as the input, and go ahead and apply that to the tweet text. And then finally, a couple other things. I want to do an aggregation, so we'll do the count to count our tweets by the hour. And we'll use the previous cell for the input. And I'm going to count by the individual words in the tweet text and when they were created. And then I'll also want to do a join. So I want to bounce that off against this table I have with the names that I'm interested in. So in that case, we have all kinds of ways to join the data. In this case, it's a match. And I'm going to use the data from the count, and I'm going to join on the individual words in the tweet text. And I'm going to join that to a MySQL table, where I have in the inventory database a table that has the names of the companies that I'm interested in. That table has only one column, which is the name. And so I say OK. And then the last thing I want to do is probably do something with the output. So in that case, I can just say, I'm going to go ahead and create maybe a pivot table. I'll use the data from the join, and I'll put the pivot table right here and click OK. At that point, I can refresh things, and I'll get my data back. So it's running the join, and then we'll bring it back. So we have our data back. Here's the count that we created. This is when it was created, and this is the name from the MySQL database. So in this simple example, these are the companies that I have. I'm counting across the last 2 hours of the 9th of September and the first 2 hours of the 10th of September from this Twitter sample data that I have. And for those companies, these are the tweet counts that they have. Now, to point out a couple things about this, what I've shown here then is the ability to create this query and do a mashup here without worrying about where things are executing or whether I was writing something in Hive or whether it was in MapReduce or SQL or any of those things. I didn't worry about data movement. All of this happened for me by the Data Hub. These are truly Excel functions. If I click on the Excel function button, it all comes up with help and everything, and these are true Excel functions. So if you know how to use functions, you can use this. Again, with the sample, I showed you the ability to get a sample of this data as you're working with it. Typically, users, as they work with these different functions, will resample their data to see how that data changes. Now that I have this particular analysis done, if I wanted to make this available for other people to use, I could simply publish this. And to do that, I would just click on Publish. I would pick one cell to publish, which is the data from that join, and I can give it a name. So in this case, I'll give it a name of Bloor and say OK. And it published that view successfully. So if I go back to my Data Explorer, I can go to our Cirro Hub, and I can look in our library under Cirro Views, and I'll see I created a new view called Bloor, and that view has 4 columns associated with it. So when you're accessing this with a BI tool like Business Objects or a data visualization tool like Tableau or something like that, they'll see this view, and that view will have these columns associated with it, and those are, has all the typical metadata that you would expect when working with a view. So that's it for the demo, and at this point, Eric, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to you.
All right, let me go ahead and get Robin Bloor into the picture here. And by the way, folks, we can obviously take your questions at any point in time. And let me go ahead and hand the keys over to Robin Bloor. Hold on one second. Yep. And Robin, if you'll just go ahead and click on, there you go, on that 4th tab. So just click anywhere on that slot and use the down arrow on your keyboard. There you go.
Okay, that's me. Thanks for that introduction, Eric.
Yes.
This is big data, hot data. Actually, this is a photograph that I took in Hawaii of a stream of lava where somebody had put the sign a little bit too close to the lava. And in the distance, there's a no parking sign there right out in the middle of the lava. I guess the point here, the thing that I'm thinking about is that to a certain extent, there's this thing about big data that in one way or another it presents an extraordinary opportunity, and there's certainly many examples where people have done that. But also it presents an awful lot of danger in technical terms, and kind of that's what I'm going to talk through. The first thing that's happened, and I think that this is like, it's just gradually becoming more and more apparent. Hadoop has become the de facto reservoir for data. It's where people tend to put the data first. It's not always the place that the data goes first. There's obviously an awful lot of data flows that already exist that don't need to go into Hadoop. There's no reason to put them there, for example. But certainly if you're dealing with any large amounts of data now which are uncharacteristic compared to what you actually used to deal with in the organization, then almost certainly people will fire up Hadoop, get a Hadoop program going and drop them into Hadoop. And Hadoop is really very versatile, and I mean the point really is what's going on. You know, I mean, like we went for 20 years where relational database gradually established itself and grew to pretty much chew up all but the obscure data stores that needed to be there because RDBS couldn't do it. But if you remember back before then, and I do because I am that old, it's what we actually had in between the flat files of the mainframe and the databases that grew up on a mainframe is we had vSAN files on the mainframe, and on other systems they were called ISAM files, and they were just basically an index sequential file. In other words, the records that were stored had one index. Actually, it depended on what you were doing because it got specialized after that. However, that's what Hadoop is natively. It's a key value store. And what happened in those days, before there was a kind of rush to have structured data, because structured data was the all-important data at that point in time, because most transaction systems could work with structured data very easily, and did, and that's how they were defined. But there was this period of time when people were doing an awful lot of things with ISAM files, and it's kind of come again. The old relational databases are no longer capable of doing the kind of big scale-out data heaps that need to be done. So we've got a whole new set of databases, column stores and NoSQL databases. The NoSQL databases are for the inconveniently structured data, let's say semi-structured or even what people might call unstructured data. And the column stores are for the more structured data. But what's kind of come in is this catch-all area, which is called Hadoop. But the difference, you know, ISAM files and their usage gradually disappeared because relational databases could do it all. This time that's not going to happen. But this time Hadoop has grown around itself in an extraordinarily short period of time, an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is itself growing. In other words, if, you know, this time next year we're discussing this kind of area of technology, it will not surprise me to discover that three or four more things that people have clicked onto Hadoop. Hadoop is become, in one way or another, it's not really a database in the way that you think of databases, but it's incredibly versatile structure. And the other thing is that big data, usually caught first by Hadoop, is mostly new data. And there are people that are taking their archive data and putting in Hadoop. It's not that that isn't happening, but the real big usage of Hadoop seems to be for new stuff, whether that's social data off the internet, you know, Twitter and Facebook stuff, or whether it's actually event data from log files, or, you know, event data that's sourced outside the organization. Thing that's worth noting about Hadoop is it's not yet a performance engine. It's not actually built for performance. It's built for parallelization, and parallelization on an individual workload capability can bring the time down. But Hadoop has not been written to be extremely fast in everything it's done. It's written to be all-purpose. And because of that, you've got usage of Hadoop like 3D rendering can be done in Hadoop, but that's not really, well, you would say it was a big data problem of a kind, but it's not really the kind of thing that most organizations would even think to do. You can grab, you know, vast amounts of data from, I don't know, from the CERN Hadron Collider, if you want to, and stick it in Hadoop, because Hadoop can do all of that stuff. But it does all of that stuff because it's all purpose and it's parallelization. It doesn't do all of that stuff because it's been built very, very specifically for certain jobs. So for that reason, you know, Hadoop is, at this point in time, it's not clear exactly how it will develop. But it is delivering business benefits in a big way. And it's certainly hot. I've heard the other day of multi-petabyte use of Hadoop that is really unstructured data three-letter organization. Probably shouldn't say more. So, you know, taking that and taking the idea of Hadoop as being this sort of area of not necessarily strongly structured stuff, but also an area where people are doing a lot of ETL tasks in the sense of throwing queries at Hadoop and pulling stuff off. Mostly what we're talking about in terms of the applications that are going against Hadoop is BI in various forms. And as anybody who's listened to any of my recent discussions on this topic, I like to divide it into hindsight, oversight, insight, and foresight. And, you know, make the comment that, well, the hindsight stuff, which is reporting operational BI, sometimes done in Excel, is reasonably well understood. We've done all that a long time ago. The oversight stuff, dashboards, OLAP, business process, and Excel, where in one way or another you're actually looking at processes and hoping to get fairly immediate information about them. Excel just became, in fact, if we were to do a discussion of BI 20 years ago, it had been pretty much all about Excel because there wasn't much else except report generators. And it continues to exist and it continues to have function, and I was really interested to watch the demo we just had because it just demonstrated to me that Excel isn't going away anytime soon. Then we have the insight stuff, data mining. That creates a kind of issue with Hadoop in the sense that you can do data mining type activity in Hadoop, but you actually have to buy the various add-ons in order to do that stuff reasonably well. And we have foresight, predictive analytics, which is not widespread use yet, but it will be. That's kind of advancing in leaps and bounds. This is kind of how I like to characterize the new BI universe. We've got Hadoop, we've got various what I think of as event stores, or possibly NoSQL databases. I mean, it depends what you're storing there, but basically performance engines. So you have Hadoop on one side, a performance engine next to it. The operational data store, data warehouse, and data marts are from, let's say, the old world, but they haven't gone away, they're still there. And then we've got this thing that I've shown on top here as Hadoop++, which is, you know, the versatility of Hadoop. You know, it can pretend to be a database in one way or another. It can be segmented up into multiple, if you like, virtual instances for Hadoop, so jobs only run on part of it. I mean, it depends on the various things that you buy. So the data layer, in my opinion, now looks like this. And if we write in the various BI applications, then we have the various applications of hindsight, insight, oversight, and foresight. But there has to be data flow middleware. In one way or another, life has got a little bit too complicated. Most of the BI tools, which should probably be going on to the next slide, most of the BI tools do not necessarily integrate well with data sources. And if we look at the data sources that I talked about, there's, you know, Hadoop and Hadoop++, standard SQL, NoSQL, but we've also got coming along at you know, a slow rate, but possibly getting faster, XML-based databases and graph DBMS, and they have very specific interfaces to get at. You've also got flat files that can have just about any interface you please, and we've also got this possibility of a metadata hub. That is, if anybody has in any way done what I would call MDM, and in fact, no matter how you've done it, you end up with a metadata reference point, from which you can resolve metadata. So, you know, the data sources are getting more and more diverse, and then there are problems in the data layer. So Hadoop is capable of ETL and often used for ETL, but usually that involves coding of a kind, because somebody's got to actually code the MapReduce Java jobs that actually run and do the ETL. And that's okay if they're just one-off jobs, but it's not okay if you're going to use it for ETL on an ad hoc basis. The data layer is much, as I've just said, much more complicated than it was, and its complexity is actually increasing. And nobody expects the complexity to go down. You know, in any way you look at it, there's going to be more variety of data. The volumes are going to continue to grow, and it's just done that for, I don't know, best part of 30 years, and it's continuing to do it. Point-to-point connectivity, you're going to have to get at the data layer. I mean, I don't think anymore of getting at a particular product. I think in terms of getting at the data layer. So point-to-point connectivity usually was a bad idea. It is nowadays a bad idea, and it may always be a bad idea. And the reason for it is that, you know, there are just too many endpoints on both sides, too many data sources, too many applications that require data, and therefore you would have to maintain all of that stuff. So you really do want, in one way or another, an over solution to all of this. Hadoop is multi-role, and hence it can spawn multiple instances, or you can end up with multiple virtual instances within Hadoop. Either way, that's not a simple thing to get at. BI tools, which definitely had good enough interfaces, even very good interfaces to RDBMS, don't link to Hadoop directly most of the time, and probably they shouldn't. They can probably go to Hadoop through Hive and HBase, but they probably shouldn't. You know, it depends what you're using Hadoop for. If you are using it as a database, then that's, in my opinion, an anomalous way of using it. That it's normally a partial use rather than complete use. So, in my view, there's a connectivity architecture that's needs to be thought about, and fundamentally it requires simple connectors, or it requires a simple capability, because self-service has become a really big deal. So, having said all of those things, I now have some questions for Cirro. Before I ask any of these, I have, you know, a very fundamental question for Mark about the Excel capability there, because it's, you know, it's very impressive that you could do that. I've not seen that before. But what wasn't clear to me, and therefore if you could kind of in some way or other explain, how do you actually configure that for users? I mean, what's the configuration process? Because you're obviously not going to give users the ability to get at every data source that exists out there.
Right. So what you have when you install the Data Hub, you register the participating systems that will be part of what we would call a data ecosystem. And then when it comes to, you also register users. And users have the same access that the rights that they have to any of the data that they normally have. In other words, there's no new granted access to the data other than what that user has in terms of authorized access already. When you install the plugin, it is simply a plugin for Excel. So installing the plugin is very simple. There's really no processing going on in Excel. Rather, the plugin creates a query that it sends to the Data Hub, and then the Data Hub figures out where does it want to go ahead and execute that query and what are the constructs required, whether part of it's in SQL, part of it's in Hive or MapReduce or whatever else. So, you know, it's not at the Excel plugin level that gets determined. All of that gets determined at the Data Hub level. And then the only thing that comes back then to the end user, in this case in the example of Excel, the only thing they're getting back then is the result set itself. But they're not doing a lot of processing on the desktop or whatever type of system that they're using.
Okay, yeah, well, I kind of understood that Cirro is doing the work, but in terms of the actual users, are you taking, do I understand it correctly that you're taking the access rights from the database itself and that you don't have anything within Cirro that defines that?
Right. So it's that user is authorized for certain levels of access within that database. That's the access that they get. Okay,
fine, fair enough. Is there any way that you can enhance that, or is that's just the way it is, and if you want to do that, you go to the database to do it?
I think, you know, usually it's going to be done at the database because that's where they're doing it for everyone else on the other BI tools and everything, you know, all the other things. So I don't see us changing it. I mean, our security model is flexible. So if there are requirements on the customer side where we need to adjust something, we certainly can.
Okay. Well, let me go on to the series of questions that I created before I actually heard the presentation. How would you use the Cirro multi-storage? It was when you talked about it, it's like, yes, there's a storage capability. Well, in my mind, you use a storage capability like that either because you want to display something logical that you're keeping in that place. So there could be a logical reason for it, or there could be a physical reason for it. You're keeping it there because it makes the performance better. So I kind of didn't understand what the multi-store is for in those terms. Is it just for physical performance, or is it because you actually want to be holding, I don't know, views there that will be used by multiple people?
So to answer the question, then it could be both. That's why it's the multi. That's why we use the word multi-store, because in different scenarios, people will use it differently. In some cases, people will want to hold some data in it. You know, for example, in many cases, you know, like a mainframe, for example, they're not going to let you process on the mainframe. They're going to download you some data and they want to stick it someplace for you to be able to run queries. So you could use it for that. Other places, you know, we have this distributed cache, and they may want a bigger cache, and they may want to put some of that on the multi-store. They may want to use it for workspace, just in general query execution. I mean, one thing to think about is the data hub doesn't limit itself to executing queries. If I'm executing a query that has two data sources, the data hub considers all the resources that it has available to it, including the multi-store. So when it's looking for processing power, it may use the multi-store as well in terms of processing a query. Queries don't have to just process where the data is located.
Right, okay. Well, you talked about, and you didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, so if you kind of would just say a little more about the optimization process, because you can optimize in various ways, but a lot of the data sources you're using have their own optimization process, so I wasn't immediately clear as to what that optimization process really meant.
So yeah, and that's a good question. So I mean, what we do with Cirro in the data hub is the optimization is around determining where to execute the query. The data hub itself doesn't actually execute the query. It's using all the participating systems in your data ecosystem. So it's focused on, with the optimizer, figuring out where do we execute the query. Once it decides that it's going to send, maybe I have a query and I break it down into 6 steps, and maybe one of those steps is going against a SQL Server database. In that case, we're not going to worry about creating optimal SQL Server syntax. We will create a SQL query that SQL Server will understand, and the SQL Server optimizer will take over from there. We didn't see a need to kind of rewrite the optimizer for all of the different databases that are out there, because those are pretty good optimizers. Our optimizer is really focused on where do we execute the query and what's the most efficient way to bring back results to a user when we're accessing multiple heterogeneous environments.
Yeah, fine. I mean, I'm presuming that in which case what your optimization is doing is you're optimizing any joins that may exist between disparate data sources, which obviously couldn't happen on those data sources. Is that right?
Exactly. So it's taking a look at what are all the different join combinations you can do. I mean, fundamentally, what you want to do is push as much processing as possible, as close to where the data sits as possible, and minimize the amount of data that you do need to move between any systems. That's really what the focus is of the optimizer.
Okay. In which case, let's move on. I've got a whole series of questions, but maybe some of these are really swift and easy to answer. It looks like I've not seen a product that's exactly like this before, even called itself an access hub in the way that you do. So what companies or products do you regard as competitors? Even, you know, if there isn't anybody that does exactly what you do, well, what would you say was close?
And what I see, Robin, is I see quite a few companies that do bits and pieces of what we do. Certainly there's a lot of vendors that line up in that incumbent approach box that I showed, and there's certainly a lot of vendors that line up in that Hadoop-centric approach that I showed. But neither one of those really are what Cirro is doing. So one thing that we get compared to frequently is things like data virtualization. But we are very different than data virtualization in that we're much easier to implement and we're much easier to administer and manage over time. And, you know, one of the key differences is our ability to federate query processing on an ad hoc basis. So with data virtualization, typically you have to know in advance what queries people want to ask or what questions people want to ask, because you're going to model everything and then you're going to create a semantic layer in that data virtualization product, which is very labor intensive to create and even more labor intensive to maintain over time. So with Cirro, we don't create a semantic layer, rather we leverage the semantic layer of the BI and data visualization tools themselves. And the Cirro Analyst Workbench is truly that, an analyst workbench that allows them to go after data in multiple ways without a lot of constraints. So otherwise, I mean, you know, other competitors, I mean, if you looked at us strictly from what we do in Excel, some people will say, well, aren't you kind of similar to what Data Mirror does? And I would say, no, we're very different than that because, first of all, what we do in Excel is a nice thing, but our core technology is really around that data hub. And, I mean, what we do in Excel is great because it is actually Excel. It's not like Excel. But Data Mirror is more an example of trying to take the data to the processing as opposed to our approach, which is really taking the processing to the data. So very different in that regard. You know, Quest has some stuff in their Toad family of products that's similar to us. They have actually something that's called a hub in one of their product offerings. And that's similar. I don't know what's going to happen with it now that they've been acquired by Dell. And then I guess there's always some new kids on the block. There's always new people coming up. And I've seen some other ones get funded here recently that seem to want to do federation of query processing, but they're going to do it only through their own proprietary user interface. And one of the things we thought of with Cirro is that it was very important for people to be able to use the existing tools and products they already have on their desktop and leverage those large investments they've already made.
Yeah, there's sense in that. Okay, so let's imagine I'm an organization that in one way or another has a requirement for what you offer, and I'm going to have lots of existing ETL stuff around and so on and so forth. So how, you know, when you get a new customer and they start to use this in anger, how does an implementation proceed? I mean, you know, in terms of, you know, what's the process actually?
Yeah, typically an installation is a pretty straightforward process. The installation, there's a little prep work getting their environment ready, but I mean, we, you know, install in less than a day, depending on the environment. I mean, if we did an Amazon installation, it's just really the push of a button and you're up in an hour. You know, certainly when you install in private clouds and other things, there's a little more work, but it never takes more than a day. And, you know, once you have everything up and running, then the next thing is to say, okay, let's register all of the systems that we want to be part of this. And as you do that, then our system will actually kick off some tests across those systems to understand some of the performance characteristics of them. And then there's the user registration process. And at that point, you're pretty good to go, depending on the sources involved and the questions they want to go after. In some cases, they may need to add some additional functions, which we can always help the customers with, or their IT organization, in many cases, has them already written, and it's just a matter of putting a wrapper on them and publishing them as a function. And then they're off and running. The download and installation of an Excel plugin, it's very quick and simple. And the integration with those other tools, in terms of BI tools, you know, it's just basically using our ODBC or JDBC driver and pointing like a business objects universe to the Cirro Data Hub, and that's all there is to it. So it's not a lot of heavy lifting, and it lets people get in quickly then to be able to start exploring their data and working with it. In many cases, customers don't even know all of the questions they want to ask of their data. They know they have 3 different unstructured data sources, and they want to be able to match this up with these other things that they have in their warehouse, things like customer data or sales data or product data. And, you know, they know they want to mash things up and start to play with it, but they have yet to have easy access to be able to do that, so they really need to start first with the playing part to find those real nuggets, those real gems, if you will, in terms of high-value queries that add value to the business.
Okay, but I mean, I'm thinking, because a lot of that is kind of what I would have expected, but, you know, it's more along the lines of, and actually it's the next question that goes with it really, is like, when somebody adopts Cirro, are you expecting that it will just become the major hub for the whole of the data layer for them? And I mean, if so, do you kind of expect to replace existing middleware that's maybe already in use, or existing ETL software, it's middleware anyway? And if so, how does this scale out? I mean, is it capable of just taking the whole load that might come out of a data layer for BI?
So we've focused on this being a hub for really analytics. So not trying to do transaction processing and things like that. But, you know, you can have multiple hubs within an enterprise. You may create one hub and implement one hub for all your people in sales and marketing. That may be a different hub for the people in engineering and manufacturing, because their data ecosystems are different. And yes, those could overlap as well, and that certainly could be handled. So, you know, the hubs themselves, you can have multiples. And the other part is, in terms of scale out, the hubs are actually quite efficient, because since we don't actually execute the queries on the data hub themselves, rather we leverage all the systems that customers already have, the data hub itself doesn't have that large of a footprint, and it's also capable of processing, you know, hundreds of queries per second. So it scales out actually quite nicely, and can handle an analytic workload, you know, quite nicely for an organization. And if they need to add more capability, they can always add more capability by adding additional data hubs.
Okay, and I'm going to have to pass you back to Eric now, or pass you to the audience. In fact, I've gone a little bit longer than I should have. But anyway, thanks.
That's quite all right. We got a bunch of good questions here, so let me just go ahead and dive right in, Mark. Okay, so right off the top, I'll just go in the order they came in, at least for starters. Does Cirro provide access to mainframe data sources such as vSAM, database, IMS, some of the really old stuff? How about that?
You know, we could provide access to those if it was a requirement, but the customers that we've worked with that have mainframes are not allowed to run anything on them because they're so constrained. So they said, look, well, you can get a dump of a file, just tell us where to put it, and we'll say, oh, put that on the multi-store. But you know, generally, customers don't even want to entertain the idea of trying to run queries into their mainframe environments because they're not allowed to. If there was a requirement to do so, we certainly could add that.
Okay, good. Now here, of course, is the $50,000 question. How much does it cost, and how do you do pricing? How does all that work?
Okay, so pricing is offered on both a subscription basis and also on a license basis. We have what we call a starter package, which starts at list pricing at $8,000 a month. And that gives you plenty, you know, an unlimited number of sources as well. You know, it has a fixed number of users associated with it, but it certainly gets most people off and running quite well. And pricing scales up, you know, appropriately from there.
Okay, good. And then how do you compare, and you talked about data virtualization, and it's not exactly like data virtualization, but it sure sounds similar. It sounds to me like you've perhaps come up with more of a programmatic and perhaps dynamic or even modular way of dealing with data virtualization type feeding, if that makes any sense. But how else could you differentiate yourself from like a Denodo or a composite?
Yeah, I think the real need around that is that, you know, both Cirro and data virtualization products do federation of query processing. So both of them accomplish that. The question is, how do you go about accomplishing that? And, you know, with a data virtualization solution, composite, Denodo, whatever, they rely on their own semantic layer that sits between the semantic layer of your BI tools and the semantic layer of the databases. And we know that both the database semantic layer and the BI semantic layers are consistently changing, and trying to keep that in sync in the center becomes very difficult. The other thing about the traditional data virtualization technologies is they weren't really designed with big data in mind, and Cirro was designed with big data in mind from the start. So, you know, we do things here without that semantic layer, and we have a way, like, you know, for Hadoop access, not only do we do Hive, but we can actually generate MapReduce directly against HDFS. You know, HBase, being able to go directly to HBase and do queries there. You know, our intent is to broaden our footprint across all of the NoSQL and new technologies that are out there that people are using for data and analytics. And we have no limitations because we're architected for that. Whereas the virtualization solutions, since they're not architected for that, it's very difficult for them to do anything beyond maybe a Hive-type query. So, I mean, those are some of the differences. Certainly there's differences in cost. I would think we're a much lower cost solution. And I think that's probably a good right there.
Okay, good. And what about different distributions of Hadoop? Of course, Cloudera has a distribution. Hortonworks has one. There is the vanilla Apache distribution. Are you keeping tabs on all of those, I presume?
Yeah. So, you know, as a matter of fact, if you wanted to do a join between Hortonworks and Cloudera Hadoop, you could do that, right? Because you can join multiple Hadoop clusters. But, yeah, we support Apache, Cloudera, Hortonworks, and we'll be adding MapR in the near future.
Yeah, and I'm guessing because what you're really doing is you're providing these connectors to all these different sources, and I have to believe that over time you will be accumulating a great deal of information, of insight about how this particular environment responds to that particular environment, different versions of different software applications, and so on and so forth. I'm guessing that's part of your overall plan, right?
Right. So that's part of the metadata repository. So we keep all our performance history in there. So the more we use, the more someone uses the data hub, the better we get at orchestrating query access, because we have a better history to know what data is used, what the execution times have been in the past, you know, and all that type of information. And that really gets into an interesting discussion around product roadmap and what we could do with that information. But I think I'll save that topic for another day.
Okay. Here's another question, kind of a specific one, but one of the attendees writes, we are currently using Astrodata as a big data platform with Hadoop cluster and Teradata data warehouse as data stores directly accessible, like a specialized big data processing hub. How does Cirro stack up to that solution? And I'm guessing the answer is that it may not be as tightly integrated as you can get Astra with Teradata, but you're offering connections to the whole other range of source and target systems out there, right?
Right. I mean, the range of source and target systems is much bigger than just, you know, Astrodata with Teradata, or you know, I mean, it's a much broader spectrum of source systems that we can go after. And what we find is, you know, most customers don't have all their analytic data in one particular vendor's product, right? I mean, everybody has all kinds of products that they're using, especially these large companies, and they want to be able to access across all of those products. And I think the other thing that people like with Cirro is that we provide this pathway for any of these new technologies that are coming out, whether they're in the cloud or out of the cloud. And that's something in terms of future-proofing that we provide that the single point solutions don't. I guess the other thing that I would say is that one of the things we do is while we federate query processing, we do that in an intelligent way. And many of the products that we've seen out there, they tend to do one thing all the time in terms of how they do data movement. They suck it back one place or the other. But, you know, with Cirro, we're intelligently doing this in terms of processing as close to the data as possible and intelligently working to minimize the data that we're moving between environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the attendees throws kind of an interesting question out here. Just says, look, we already have Oracle, MS SQL, SAP Business Objects 4, and Tableau, Tableau software and Spotfire on top of all that. So why would we switch to Cirro? And I'm guessing, again, that your story here is going to be that you can, at least over a period of time, simplify the complexity of having all those different tools, right? I mean, the idea is that you will sort of serve as a virtual hub reconciling all these different kinds of systems to where down the line it's going to take a lot less time to manage that complexity, right?
Well, absolutely. And then when it comes to, some things like, depending on the products, I mean, Tableau, for example, we add a significant amount of value to. Tableau itself is limited to data blending when you're trying to do joins across multiple data sources. They don't actually do true joins. It's data blending. With Cirro, you can do true joins with Tableau across multiple data sources, and you'll get better performance than you would if you just did data blending, because the joins are not happening up in the BI server itself, or the Tableau server in that case. They're happening down in the data systems where the data is at, which are frequently parallel processing systems. So you're going to get much faster performance. You're going to get true enterprise class joins. You're going to be able to join data sources of both unstructured and structured data like you've never been able to before. And best of all, people can do this in a self-service thing. We support all those tools that people have. We support all the platforms that people have. We just provide a nice single place that people can go to access that data without having to create connectors and strategies for every different technology you want to use.
Right, sure. And I threw up this slide because I really love, actually I didn't throw any slide up at all because I haven't given myself the keys, so I'm going to throw it now. I like this slide here just because it shows the complexity, and let's face it, this is one of the realities right now in dealing with big data, and in particular this whole open source world of Hadoop and MapReduce and Hive and all these other things, is that you need some developers to be able to work on that, and no doubt about it, that is going to change. I mean, we've already seen a few vendors moving aggressively in the direction of providing GUI, more attractive, intuitive GUI-based layers for managing big data, moving it around, processing, analyzing it, and so forth. But for right now, it's still pretty complex stuff. But we have a couple of very specific questions. So one of the attendees writes, how does the hub look in terms of access? Like, in other words, what kind of access controls do you have? Do you just go through LDAP? Do you have specific security controls that tie into all the different BI tools? And then can stored processes be triggered to execute in batch form? That's another question.
Sure, you could do anything that you can do in a BI tool or a data visualization tool can also be done through a command line interface. And if you can do it in a command line interface, you could certainly wrap that and execute it as any batch process or anything else. Depending on the BI tools you're using, you could schedule it through those existing BI tools you have to execute a process that's running with the data hub. So that's another option there. And what was the rest of the question? I think I answered the end of it first.
Yeah, just let's see what the hub looks like in terms of access to individuals. So
yeah.
What kind of security features?
So for them, it's the same. To them, it's pretty transparent because we're passing through the access credentials that we get from the tools that people are using. We also have an administration console for the data hub itself, so there's a place for the administrator to go and work on the data hub itself in terms of registering data sources and looking at the metadata and things like that. But from a security perspective, we're trying to make it as easy as possible without creating new layers of security. Rather, we're leveraging the existing security and protocols that people already have in place.
Okay, good. And a couple more questions, then we'll wrap up. One of the attendees asks, how would SaaS model builders, as in SaaS Institute, use Cirro as their primary data source?
That's an interesting question, because we had that come up the other day with a customer where they wanted us to go after data that's in the SaaS server. And, that's something that we're actually looking at and exploring right now. I don't know I don't know how SAS will respond to us wanting to query their server and possibly move data in other places, but it's something that we have had some active interest in, and we're actually exploring at this point.
We actually had that question. I think last week was Teradata on the line, and he gave a pretty interesting response too. He's like, "Well, the partnership is what it is." So you see this kind of jockeying taking place all over creation. So, and what about connecting to some of these other stores? We talked about Hadoop, of course, but what about Cassandra, MongoDB, some of the other open source projects out there?
Yeah, so we have HBase underway, and a lot of the stuff initially has been around Hadoop and integrating that with relational sources. So we have a large number of relational sources we support, whether it's Oracle, Teradata, MySQL, Greenplum, and the list goes on. So that Hadoop relational integration was the primary driver. The way, like I said, we have HBase underway right now. Once HBase is done, then I think Mongo is the next one that we're going to work on. But the idea is that the way we've architected the product, typically for us to add a new RDBMS, it's around a 3-week effort, and then for us to add like a NoSQL source, it's around a 4 to 6 week effort, and that's pretty quick, and that's how we architected the product. So a good architecture makes it easy to add things in the future.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about query optimization, and that certainly conjures up images of business intelligence more so than big data analytics, but you're really also trying to fuse these two worlds, right? I mean, is that part of the mission, is to provide a hub that also will, by virtue of what it's doing, facilitate the merging of big data analytics with traditional BI?
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to that theme I had before about, the old world, the new world. The old world doesn't go away, and there's a real need for people to get a bridge in place that helps them use and leverage their investments that they've already made into pursuing new things like a big data initiative or a big data strategy. It doesn't mean you have to reinvent everything and have all new products to be able to do that. So we saw that need in the market very early on. I mean, it's been very much validated with, we're partnered with both Cloudera and Hortonworks, and it's validated very quickly because we really deliver on that last mile of Hadoop. This idea that it's great. Customers, they'll say, well, it's great. I got all this data in Hadoop. That's wonderful. Now what? How do I integrate this data that I have in Hadoop and mash it up with everything else that I have in my enterprise? And don't tell me I have to move everything in one direction or the other to be able to do that. I need to be able to do it where everything's sitting. And we saw that need coming quite a while ago, and that's what we focused on. And we're very happy to say that the market is indeed developed this way, and the offering that we now have in the market is becoming more and more relevant every day.
Right. Well, folks, it has been yet another wonderful adventure here in the briefing room. Very big thank you to our own Robin Bloor for his time today, and to Mark Theissen from Cirro. Yes, we will archive this webcast for later viewing, so by all means, feel free to come check it out. It's usually available right away, so we'll get that up and running at InsideAnalysis.com. With that, we're going to bid you farewell, and thank you so much for a great year. This was the 41st briefing room of 2012. We already have 20 lined up for you for next year. And with that, we're going to bid you farewell, folks. Once again, thank you so much for your time and attention. Take care. Bye-bye.